Pentagon spokesman John Kirby. Let's talk to security analyst Chidi Wanda, who joins us virtually from London. Good morning to you. Thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
Let's take a look at this issue of use or non-use of nuclear weapons to start off with. None of the countries involved here, neither the US nor Russia, have committed to a no first use policy, which means that they can, in fact, use nuclear weapons without being provoked, if you like.
Well, the first thing I would mention is that the US is not a direct party to the conflict, so it doesn't. Its policy in this respect is always going to be reactive. So the party that one has to be more focused on is obviously Russia, which is a nuclear weapon and also a nuclear state, and also their doctrine does call for the use of tactical nuclear weapons in certain circumstances. And at the same time, as part of this conflict, President Putin and his staff have stated that if Russia faces an existential situation, they will consider the use of nuclear weapons. And then we've also got to factor in that Russia has form in terms of using, what we would call weapons of mass destruction. So we've got the Salisbury incident in the United Kingdom, where it was used in an assassination attempt, other assassination attempts like against Litvinenko and so on. And also they've allied with the Syrians who used chemical weapons in Aleppo, in Idlib and other parts of Syria. That's where we would look at this in terms of people who have form or people who have a reputation of doing this, whether they would risk such an escalation in Europe, in a country bordering NATO, is another story.
Let's take a look at what the Pentagon spokesperson talked about now, the issue of good faith negotiations. It looks like everyone is coming finally to the convergence that negotiations are the way to go to end this. But the question that some who are outside looking in ask is, why wasn't this the first line of action instead of all the carnage and all the destruction that has happened since February 24th?
Well, the thing is that all wars will end with negotiation. It doesn't matter how severe the defeat or the victory of one side is. There will always be a period where somebody will sit down and talk through things. It happened in the Nigerian Civil War with the complete defeat of Biafra. There was still a negotiated settlement at the end. It happened at the end of the Second World War when the Allies completely defeated Nazi Germany. There was still a negotiation, even if it just happened for a day at the end, for how the surrender will take place. Why it didn't happen originally, I mean, the only person who can answer that is President Putin. There is very little he is going to achieve out of this that he wouldn't have achieved at the negotiating table. In fact, by engaging in this war, he has changed the calculus. Whereas before you would have a Ukraine where there was a significant pro-Russian element, now with the death, the destruction, and the fighting, that element is almost wholly concentrated in the east, where Russia has declared its new republics, and even there, they have a new calculus in that before they were part of Ukraine, and I know lots of people from the east of Ukraine, they were part of Ukraine, so they had a lot of the privileges that Ukrainians had. They could travel on a Ukrainian passport, they could access EU funding and things like that. So now that's gone. All they have left is the Russian element. So how this will end will obviously be a negotiation. What brings both sides to that negotiating table is the key question. And from what it appears, the Russian side needs to achieve some sort of a military victory, a decisive military victory in which they can declare they've achieved their objectives and then sit down and talk. Whether the Ukrainians will accept that, again, is another question.
I'll have to ask you about the other side, though. President Zelensky is accused maybe of a strategic error in this regard of goading Russia into this and then now finding out that those he thought were allies and would back Ukraine to the hilt, including putting boots on ground, imposing a no-fly zone, and so on, haven't done so. And you alluded to that when in your answer to the first question, you talked about the U.S. not being a direct participant. NATO is also not a direct participant. The EU is not a direct participant in this. It's Russia versus Ukraine. Do you think that perhaps he also made a mistake?
I mean, President Zelensky, up until this war, was a fairly inconsequential president. He had many issues with corruption. He had many issues with poor administration, with anti-democratic behaviors as well. But in terms of this war, I find it hard to ascribe a lot of blame to him because he was faced with a very, very non-negotiable situation, I would say. The Russians massed forces on his border. They issued a number of threats. They increased the fighting in Donbass and Luhansk. A lot of Ukrainian soldiers were killed in the lead up to the war, fighting in Donbass and Luhansk. We've got to be very clear. He was elected on a platform of ending this war through negotiation. Now, there was no Ukrainian president who would have acceded to Russian demands before the war and who would have kept his job. So following his democratic mandate, there was nothing he could have done and to accede to the Russian demands, which were deliberately from the Russian side unachievable. So no country is going to accept giving up their territory. No country is going to accept dismantling their military. No country is going to accept being told who you will partner with and who you will not partner with. So I think everyone was fairly clear that this was a build-up to a crisis. What nobody expected was for Russia to launch a full-scale war. One expected a very limited war, but not a war of this extent. And I think even the Russians were surprised. Everybody outside of President Putin was surprised about this war starting because this has been seen. It's not easy for the Russians. They're taking heavy casualties, huge amounts of losses. And the most important thing is a lot of their mystique and prestige is gone. The fear of Russian ground forces. So I speak as somebody who spends a lot of time, in this kind of world, and there was a great fear and respect for Russian air forces and Russian ground forces, and that's gone. Everyone has seen them fighting and seen them being beaten quite badly, and so Russia has lost a lot of prestige and mystique just from committing into this action.
There is President Zelensky saying that he wants a face-to-face, one-on-one meeting with President Putin. But given the background you've just given and given what has gone on since this war started and some of the very heated rhetoric on both sides, is that advisable and what can it achieve even if it were to take place?
Well, it's advisable on the basis that negotiations have to take place, irrespective, as I alluded to earlier. This war will only end with a negotiation. But we also need to understand the doctrine of negotiations and peace talks, especially in the Russian or Soviet doctrine. The fascinating thing about this war is that both sides, again, just like the Nigerian Civil War, both sides are fraternal countries. Their military history is the same. They're both part of the Soviet Union. When people say, Russia or the Soviet Union helped during the liberation struggle, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union at that time. The doctrines that they're using are exactly the same. And part of the Russian doctrine is that you will always engage in negotiations as part of a conflict. That is to buy time. So you see the Russians now talking about negotiations, holding peace talks, giving humanitarian corridors. At the same time, they're consolidating their forces around Kiev. They're consolidating their forces in the east, bringing up supplies, trying to bring in reinforcements. All negotiations are part of warfare. So this is just a pause. If President Zelensky can meet President Putin, if they can come to some sort of an agreement, it will be positive, obviously, for the Ukrainian people. But it is highly unlikely at this point. Currently, President Putin does not have much regard for President Zelensky in his eyes. To use a Nigerian kind of phrase, President Zelensky is a small boy to him. So it's very unlikely he's going to sit down and talk to him or even give him any concessions. So as I said before, one side has to achieve a decisive military kind of victory in order to force the other side to serious negotiations.
This is the first time you're talking to us from London. And this is the first time Britain has faced a foreign crisis of this magnitude since it left the European Union. How have you seen its activities in terms of support, coordination with the EU, and it, of course, remains a member of NATO, but how have you seen the coordination of its efforts with regard to this war and the position that it has taken on things like human rights and all of that with a view to securing supplies of energy outside of Russia, which was the traditional supplier before all of this unfolded?
So that's a fascinating question because this is, as you said, this is Britain's first big test post Brexit, and we would say that the record is mixed in terms of it's shown really great leadership and strong support in terms of sending weapons, especially the NLAWs, the javelins, and other weapon systems and other forms of advice and guidance that it's providing to Ukraine. It's also shown a lot of leadership in terms of coordinating sanctions. At the same time, it struggles because, like everybody in Europe, they've got drunk on Russian money. The UK has a huge amount of Russian money. A lot of oligarchs and Putin's friends and allies are living here, and their wives, their mistresses, their children are either living here, studying here, have their money here. And the UK, delayed its sanctions long enough, just long enough for them, a lot of them, to move that money. At the same time, as you said, we've got the energy issue. So the rest of Europe, especially the further east you go in Europe, from France, Germany, all the way up to the Central and Eastern European states, they're heavily dependent on Russian gas. This is a legacy of the Cold War, where people wanted to make sure that there was an economic interdependence between the Soviet Union and Western Europe, so as to reduce the probability of conflict. Now, that is a difficult thing for these countries to wean themselves off, because you need to develop a whole new set of infrastructure to bring LNG in from the coast or gas in from the North Sea. And at the same time, we've got the climate crisis where everyone's trying to wean themselves off fossil fuels. Europe should have done this a long time ago, but they're doing it now. Now, for the UK, it's very easy to wean yourself off Russian gas because we don't really use that much Russian gas, which is why we can go to Saudi Arabia and other countries and Qatar and ask them for help. And I think the final element of this is the domestic element in the United Kingdom. Prior to this crisis, the British government was in its own internal crisis about lockdown. I mean, it seems very childish now to talk about lockdowns and Partygate and whether the Prime Minister had cake, at his party or not, and things like that. And it was deeply unpopular with the British people due to how lockdown had affected a lot of people. This crisis has saved them. The Prime Minister has been able to act like a statesman, act like a serious person, and take away a lot of the pressure that was on him and his party due to what we call Partygate here. And then the final element is in terms of the military. Now, something that puts a lie, to be honest, to Vladimir Putin's fear of NATO is that Europe has been rapidly demilitarizing since the end of the Cold War. The British Army, in its last review, cut its soldiers down to less than 80,000, which is a tiny number for a country like the United Kingdom. It has less than 200 tanks. It has no armored personnel carriers. It's cutting its fighter aircraft. Its biggest investment has been aircraft carriers, for which it doesn't have enough aircraft. So what we've seen in Europe is, whilst Vladimir Putin has talked up the threat of NATO, in reality, NATO is militarily quite weak, except for the United States. What this crisis has done is shown that the value of having an army, the value of having well-trained, well-equipped forces, and the big crisis that's not being talked about, and we might see that today with what's the spring statement from the Chancellor, who is a finance minister here, is whether the United Kingdom will start building its armed forces up again, or whether it's going to remain as a small force that, in its current state, could not confront the Russians the way the Ukrainians are. So these are the key domestic and international factors that I think the UK will be focusing on.
There's a lot to unpack there, and as you said, in the coming days, we'll know how this all pans out. But there's just enough time for me to say thank you very much, Chidinwanda, for joining us this morning from London in the United Kingdom. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take a break. We'll have updates, further updates, that is, on day 28 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Please stay with us.